From the Golden State Warriors handing out a 15-year contract to Chris Webber to the 4-year, $171 million contract that John Wall signed, the NBA is no stranger to handing out massive deals, but not all of them tend to work out. And for that reason alone, I'm presenting to you the worst contracts in NBA history, starting with none other than the Lakers signing a two-time All-Star Luol Deng. This was basically just one of the many terrible decisions that the Lakers took during the 2010s. However, it's also one of their most expensive mistakes of all time. The franchise wanted to beef up their roster and signed Deng in the offseason of 2016 in preparation for Kobe's departure, and they committed $72 million over 4 years on Luol, who would only play 56 games in his first season, averaging less than 8 points per game. Can't get worse, right? Only for Deng to play one more game in the next season, which would be his last. But the Lakers ended up paying Deng up until 2022. But talking about expensive mistakes, I just can't wrap my head around the stupidity the Golden State Warriors committed back in the 1990s when they signed Chris Webber on a 15-year deal for $74.4 million. Now hear me out. This was before the NBA's rookie salary scale was implemented, and for anyone saying that there was no need for it, this deal should tell you exactly why it was made mandatory. Basically, the Warriors gave their number one pick, Chris Webber, a $74.4 million deal over 15 years. They had a lot of faith in their first pick, and for good reason, because Webber turned out to be a decent player. Then what was the problem? Well, as it turns out, the Warriors, while happy to give out a 1.5-decade-long deal, were also okay with including a clause that lets him opt out after his first year and become a restricted free agent. Oh, please make it make sense. This is exactly what happened as Webber exercised the clause, forcing a move to Washington, and the Warriors ended up with a Tom Gugliotta. It's okay if you don't know him. He only lasted up until February, but only for the Warriors to get it even more horribly wrong, because the deal resulted in another first pick. They used it to pick Vince Carter, and they ended up trading him too. But wait until you hear what the Grizzlies did with this next one, when they signed Chandler Parsons to a $94.5 million contract spanning 4 years. I mean, if it wasn't clear enough that this fella had red flags all over him because of his injuries, the Grizzlies could have at least stopped to think about whether it was a good idea, because Parsons literally signed his contract with Dallas in a strip club. However, it wouldn't stop Parsons from opting out of his deal with the Mavericks, as he agreed to a monster $94.5 million contract with the Grizzlies. But with his knee situation getting worse, he would only end up playing 95 games over 3 seasons, and forced Memphis into a full rebuild mode, losing Marc Gasol and Mike Conley. But it worked pretty well for Chandler, who actually received $25 million from the Atlanta Hawks in 2020 for barely playing, after the Grizzlies dumped his contract on the Hawks.
All over Harden now. Lost it back to Parsons. 5 on the shot clock. Parsons steps back, fires. You can hang a watch on that shot. 14-30 run.
But if you think that's bad, this next one will have you feeling sorry for the franchise. Truly, as the New York Knicks signed Allen Houston to a 6-year, $100 million contract in 2001. Don't get me wrong, Houston was a fine player. He even hit the clutch shot to take the Knicks to the finals in 1999. But he was never quite a superstar, and was also 30 when the Knicks made this decision. It just didn't make any sense for the Knicks to sign him to a massive contract at that age, especially as Houston ended up getting injured again and again. And as you know, it's almost impossible to be the same player as you once were after a knee injury. But his contract created such a buzz in the NBA, for the wrong reasons, that the NBA had to take a stand and introduced the amnesty provision in the collective bargaining agreement, which was genuinely known as the Allen Houston rule. I mean, even the NBA felt bad for the Knicks. But the Knicks never quite learned their lesson, and throughout their history, they signed many big men, in particular, to horrible contracts. Worst of all, though, was Eddie Curry, who was signed to a 6-year contract worth $60 million in 2005. And it came right after the Knicks had splashed the cash on Jerome James a year before. Fair to say they were both absolutely terrible, but Curry definitely had the worst contract. I get the appeal. Curry had led the Bulls to the playoffs at only 22, but as it turned out, he had lots of health issues. More than that, he just wasn't a good fit on the floor. He could score, yes, but that's all he could do. And by 2008, Curry was weighing over 330 pounds, and he was out of rotation immediately. But it's not only the Knicks that have made some terrible decisions over the years, as few have been worse than the Washington Wizards signing Gilbert Arenas on a huge $111 million contract over 6 years. Again, on paper, it made a lot of sense. He was one of the most electrifying players during his prime, but ever since his MCL injury, Arenas just wasn't the same. But injuries are still an understandable excuse. Arenas actually had to sit a whole season out because he brought guns to the locker room. And with many more injury woes followed by scandals, the Wizards and Arenas both were haunted by that $111 million figure. However, it doesn't hold a candle to what the Grizzlies did in 1997, when Bryant Reeves was signed to a $62 million contract spanning 6 years. And fair to say, he never quite came good. Maybe the Grizzlies felt obliged to keep their pick locked away. But whatever way you think about it, Reeves was just bang average. He was never quite NBA material and would retire before even playing 400 games with the team. Many believe it was the worst contract ever handed out. But I see that and I raise them. Ben Simmons was signed to a whopping $177.2 million contract over 5 years.
Simmons, take a little hook shot, can't get it to go. Claxton finds Simmons cutting, and he will dump that one in.
What was the front office of the 76ers thinking? Yeah, Simmons was good, and there was a lot of potential, but it's turned out horribly, hasn't it? From being labeled as the face of the franchise to being shipped out after countless injuries, a dramatic strike, and having to sit out an entire season. Now the Brooklyn Nets are stuck with the Australian defender, who's their highest paid player.
With the Pistons. Here's Simmons bodying down. Simmons taking his time and finishing the first basket.
And 1 year on since his switch to Brooklyn, the team still doesn't know what his best position is. Fortunately for Simmons, he's saved by the mistake the Washington Wizards made and the Houston Rockets were left with, which was the massive $171 million 4-year contract. Yeah, James Harden leaving the Rockets was a good idea for the franchise.
Harden on Jackson, isoing. Drives left, good job by Jackson. Then eventually, Harden crossed him over, snapped his ankles, and laid it up and in with the left hand on the left-hand side.
As they finally got rid of the drama, and they could have completed their rebuild earlier and not be stuck as the worst team in the franchise for years now if they hadn't signed John Wall from the Wizards. And the Wizards actually got away by signing Wall to that insane contract, which for me remains the worst in NBA history. He was forced by the Rockets to play 10 minutes a game or to get traded.
Fox guarding him, and John Wall turns the corner by driving left. Remember, we talked about how he likes to drive left. And then the hang in the air, look at how he uses his backside right there to get a little bit of space to go high off the glass.
Right after arriving in Houston, but Wall decided to stick around and pocket the dough for an entire season, and the two sides finally came to a costly buyout agreement at the beginning of the 2022-23 season. Well, that's all I had on the worst contracts in NBA history.